You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 17th of December 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program, Brazil is heading for a big year of presidential elections and the stage has been set for a repeat of sorts. Lula versus Bolsonaro, just not the Bolsonaro we've known from the past. Fernando Augusto Pacheco will explain. After that,
sometimes we are tempted to despair, but if we are to stay the course, if we are to remain on track, we must also learn to lift our gaze.
The Global Refugee Forum has been underway in Geneva, and the UN's Filippo Grandi, who you heard there, has a surprisingly optimistic take. We'll hear more about that. We'll also hear about bears in Japan from Monocle's Ryuma Takahashi, and we'll talk fashion and Prada's attempts to make amends in India. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. Welcome to our midweek edition of The Briefing. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Hope you're getting ready for the holidays next week. We will start in Brazil because the country is gearing up for presidential elections next year, and the race is now shaping up to be one between President Lula da Silva and Flávio Bolsonaro, the son of former President Jair Bolsonaro, who's now become the chief candidate on the right flank. Well, Fernando Augusto Pacheco is Monocle's senior correspondent, resident Brazilian, joins me right here in the studio. Good afternoon, Fernando.
Good afternoon, Chris. Good to be here.
We've got you right on the top because this is big news.
It is big news.
Brazil. Is Brazilian politics becoming dynastic?
Well, in a way, yes. I mean, Lula doesn't have necessarily a successor, but he is. What an impressive force, I have to say. Since the late 80s, he's been present in everyone's lives. But I think you mentioned the dynasty of the Bolsonaro family. It is a dynasty, undeniably so. Of course, it's a weakened dynasty. So the story here is Flávio Bolsonaro, who is currently a senator for the state of Rio de Janeiro. He said he will be the candidate from the right. He's going to represent, in a way, his father and the voters that admire that ideology. He had impressive numbers. The first poll, including his name, came out last night, and today's the big story in the Brazilian newspapers. Lula is still very much ahead with 41%, Flávio Bolsonaro with 23%, and Tarcísio de Freitas, who is the governor of São Paulo, and people are saying if it's not going to be a Bolsonaro, it's going to be Tarcísio. He's got 10%. So that's bad news for Tarcísio if you think about it, Chris.
So it shows that the right, in other words, is fractured, but also that Lula does not have 50%. So it's a sign that there is still division. There's a lot all to play for, I suppose, heading into next year's presidential elections. As you said, this is a weakened dynasty. Jair Bolsonaro, in lots of legal trouble, obviously, has seen his support drop. But what do you make of his son? Is it a surprise that he is in this position?
It's not necessarily a surprise, but I think it's bad news for the right, and I'll explain why. Because although Bolsonaro, anyone from the Bolsonaro family would have, I think, similar numbers here. The problem is there's still a lot of rejection to those numbers. And I think with someone like Tarcísio, maybe he's not polling as well right now because I think many Brazilians, especially outside São Paulo, maybe still do not know him. But I think the advantage of Tarcísio, in my view, is that he would potentially get it in the end, all those Bolsonaro votes. They would not vote for Lula for sure, but he might get some of the centrist votes, because Tarcísio de Freitas, I think the market, as we say, really likes Tarcísio. I think that, he's very much pro-business, there's the business community in São Paulo wouldn't be, sad if Tarcísio win. So that's the problem. And I still think some people center-right might look, another Bolsonaro. I might not vote. I'm not necessarily saying that they would go for Lula again. So it's kind of a tricky situation. The Bolsonaros will poll better, but can they gain new voters? I'm not sure.
And tell us how this works in Brazilian presidential elections. Could Lula win without 50%? Is there a runoff? What's the sort of style of this? What happens if there is a fractured vote on the right?
To win, you need more than 50% of the vote. If not, it's going to the second round. And traditionally, a presidential race in Brazil goes to the second round. That's kind of almost expected. And I have numbers for you here as well. So Lula would get 46% and Flávio Bolsonaro 36%.
If it was just the two of them, in other words.
If it's just the two of them. And again, Flávio Bolsonaro is polling better than the other candidates for the right. It's early days, but I think it's a pretty good position to look. But I think Lula is still the man to beat. I mean, I'm not saying he's crazy popular at the moment, but I think he's been lucky, again, with this fracture, on the right as well.
He is lucky, perhaps, somewhat popular as well, such a force in Brazilian politics. Are there, it must be asked, there's always so many parallels, I have to say, between the US and Brazil, whether it's Bolsonaro and Trump, but also, frankly, Lula and Biden, if I may, although not that you see that in quite the same way. There's an energy level with Lula, but are there any concerns about his age heading into this next year in the presidential elections? He is 80 years old.
Funnily enough, a year ago, there was more conversation about that, but I don't know what Lula is doing, but he looks pretty fit to me, I mean, you can still see actually Lula, there's a picture of him wearing Speedos, I mean, look at him. I mean, I think he looks great for an 80-year-old man. I'm not just talking about looks. There's a sense of energy, when he gives a speech, there's not so many issues as we saw that with Joe Biden. But yeah, 80, is quite impressive. I think he would potentially be one of the oldest Brazilian leaders ever if he wins next year. So this conversation is a little bit quieter now. It's sad as well from the left because I don't think there's a clear successor to Lula. I mean, after Lula, honestly, what's next? You have names like Fernando Haddad, João Campos, but no one with the same kind of amount of charisma, like Lula. Lula is very much a unique character in Brazilian politics.
Well, we will be talking more about the presidential elections, no doubt, as we enter 2026. But Fernando, you had some other news for us as well. We wanted to talk about the return of Rio Fashion Week.
Very surprising, because, when I grew up in Brazil, there were two fashion weeks in the country. São Paulo, which is the more established one, but then Rio, which was quite good and actually very respected. They were great, especially with swimwear. But for 10 years, there was no fashion week in the city. It's back. So the mayor, Eduardo Paes, announced, it was quite an interesting post. I mean, basically, it was himself parading on a catwalk. It was kind of AI images, and he was wearing all sorts of different different clothing as well. So it's back from the 15th to the 18th of April. But I think there will be some changes in the fashion calendar in Brazil. There will be two fashion weeks. I think in the first semester, Rio is going to showcase, the fashion week, and São Paulo is going to do it in the second semester. So São Paulo is not going to have two in the same year. So I think it's going to be kind of divided between both cities. But there's one thing that I was a little bit annoyed, if I may mention that.
Give us your annoyance, Fernando.
The vice mayor of Rio, Eduardo Cavalieri, he was saying like how happy he was that Rio is back with fashion. But then he said that São Paulo Fashion Week was tacky. I mean...
Oh, he's taking the fight to Sao Paulo. So this is they're not going to complement each other necessarily. This is a fight between Rio and Sao Paulo, straight up.
I think we're not even pretending there, friends. I mean, Eduardo, he was very savage saying that, which I completely disagree. But having said that, I'm kind of joking. I think Rio deserves, is the second biggest city in Brazil. And they do set trends in Brazil, especially in the summer. I mean, what bikini to wear, what summer clothes, the colors. I mean, it's a very vibrant and cultural city. I think they deserve their own fashion week. But São Paulo is still the powerhouse of fashion. I don't think is going to change.
You're being the bigger man there, Fernando. You're not taking the bait and dissing Rio de Janeiro.
Never.
Fernando Augusto Pacheco, Monocle's senior correspondent. Thanks for joining us. And now here's Monica Lillis with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. US President Donald Trump has ordered a complete blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers in and out of Venezuela. In a post on Truth Social, Trump wrote that Nicolas Maduro's government had been designated a terrorist organization. Venezuela rejected Trump's claims as a grotesque threat, with Maduro saying that the US wants to control his country's vast oil reserves. Australian authorities have charged a man who opened fire on a Jewish Hanukkah celebration on Sydney's Bondi Beach with terrorism and murder charges. 15 people were killed in the attack, with many more still receiving treatment for injuries. Meanwhile, the State Parliament of New South Wales is set to reconvene this week to pass stricter gun laws. And visitor numbers to Japan grew 10.4% year-on-year in November, according to the country's tourism board. This pushed the total arrivals for 2025 to 39 million, exceeding the last year's record. However, visitors from mainland China slowed as a result of an ongoing political dispute. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Monica. Now, it has been an extremely challenging year to be a refugee, with many Western nations closing their doors at a time where foreign aid has been cut and the number of refugees and conflicts around the world continues to rise. Nonetheless, at the Global Refugee Forum 2025 in Geneva this week, the UN's High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, tried to sound an optimistic note in his address, saying much had been accomplished in the last decade that can be built on, even in these challenging times. And here to explain some of that to us and the state of refugees around the world is Matthew Saltmarsh, Chief Spokesman for the UN Refugee Agency. Matthew, thanks so much for coming on the show. Perhaps we can start with the challenges that we do, I suppose, know quite well at this point. They're really summed up in two ways: conflicts and this reluctance to take in refugees as conflicts grow.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. I think that's right. I mean, there's been for some time now a proliferation of conflicts. You're looking at long-standing conflicts, some regions that have been unstable for decades in many cases, but we've had flare-ups of smaller conflicts in other regions more recently, and then you've got a situation like Sudan, where it kind of mutates and moves around the country, flaring up and then dying down in one part and so on. So there's that complexity, and you can throw climate change, of course, into the mix. And then you can also add to the fact that, you have asylum seekers on the move, but you also have migrants on the move. And that complicates things, certainly in terms of the public's perception of people on the move. It's perhaps not as simple as it used to be. So all that is complicated. And then in addition to that, this year we've had massive funding cuts in the humanitarian space. I mean, speaking for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, we have reduced our budgets by some 35% this year, and we've lost 5,000 or so colleagues. And that's devastating within the organization. But more importantly, it's devastating for refugees, because we estimate that about 1/3 of the people that we would normally support with our assistance, whether that's sort of blankets, tents, clothing, medicine, that kind of thing, 1/3 of them won't get the support that they had last year, and that's about 11.5 million people. So the effects on the ground are huge, and I don't think it's something that's been particularly reported in depth by the mass media. I mean, we have seen some coverage, but I'm not sure just how aware the public are of what's happening in refugee camps and settlements and places which host refugees. And I think the impact of this will be seen for many years to come. Having said that, we are here at this refugee forum, and it is a place where we gather together all the different partners who are involved in supporting refugees, not least refugees themselves, and there's some 250 of them here, alongside governments, NGOs, UN, businesses, and so on. And I think what's positive here, and this is what our High Commissioner Filippo Grandi was trying to stress in his remarks, is that it is still positive that these different partners come together and that they work on different projects. Now, these are not, in most cases, major projects that capture the public's attention, but they are smaller scale projects in areas of displacement. That could be around things like connectivity, that could be around things like the inclusion of refugees in sporting activities, that could be faith-based activities, that could be more sort of policy related to do with asylum laws in different countries and so on. So the fact that, that all these partners are gathering and that pledges are being made and that commitments are being made is positive, and it's something to hold on to in otherwise quite dark times.
Tell us more about the impact of that drop in foreign aid as you described there, even if there's this optimistic side that the work is going on behind the scenes. I guess what I'm curious about is whether you still try to make an argument, are able to make an argument that foreign aid helps also Western nations. And this is something we've talked about on this show, that even in a time where Western nations might be reluctant to take in refugees, then at the very least, they should be helping those nations where refugees are in order to stop the flow of refugees to Europe. Is that sort of national security almost argument, does that have any put through, anything that's discussed there? How are you trying to make the case to keep foreign aid alive?
Well, we always stress that something like 2/3 to 3/4 of refugees are in less wealthy countries and that they stay close to the country from which they fled. The perception is not always the same in the global north. It's often, and this can be because for political reasons, or this can be the way that it's interpreted in social media or traditional media, there is a perception that all refugees are heading to our countries, that's from the global north. It's just simply not the case. The data show that. So we think that it is important, and we've been saying this for many years, that those countries that are bearing the biggest burden, shouldering the biggest burden of supporting refugees, that they continue to get support from the international community. And that remains very much the case. And, you know, we have made that argument, the point that you made, that if that assistance is not forthcoming, then people are left with very few options. One is to stay in a very difficult situation, often where you're not getting, first of all, you're not getting good shelter and food, but you're probably not getting the opportunity to retrain, to maybe get some form of economic activity or employment going. And when you don't have those opportunities, there is then much more motivation to try to move. And the obvious destination for people to move is to try to go to wealthier countries, so in the global north. And so there is certainly a fragility and stability argument that humanitarian, but not just humanitarian, development assistance, the two going together increasingly, is very important in stabilizing fragile regions and in trying to dissuade people from moving. And if people don't move in those numbers, then you don't get these dangerous journeys that we hear so much about, and the terrible incidents on land and particularly at sea where people perish and take those really acute risks to try to reach safety, but also to try to reach places from where they can earn themselves a living.
Just a quick final word, Matthew. I mean, Filippo Grandi talked about the accomplishments that are already there, that we shouldn't shy away from them, that now is the time to build on that. You touched on that as well, but just tell us, how do you build on that going forward?
Well, I think the way to do it is what is happening here at this Global Refugee Forum. So the way to build progress, and we know that it's difficult among states. The big donors have cut back hugely this year. They're focusing much more on defense, particularly the European countries. So we think that the way to make progress, we've always said that involves focusing on the root causes of displacement. So it's making peace. It's assisting people who need that support in their immediate displacement location. But then it's also bringing together different and new actors to look at working from the ground up. And that's where I think it is interesting that we've got representatives of the private sector here. We've got representatives from faith-based groups, sports groups, from NGOs, refugees themselves, and so on, trying to put together projects in different regions, in different settings that allow displaced people to stand on their own feet, to potentially to work, to have economic activity, to have education. And from that, there's certainly a case that stability will come. And that people will feel less compelled to have to move on and make these dangerous journeys.
Matthew Saltmarch, Chief Spokesperson for the UN Refugee Agency, thank you very much for joining us today. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now you're back with The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak. 2025 has been a year that could be described as a turning point in Japan's relationship with, wait for it, bears. Yes, bear numbers have increased, and so have bear attacks. Sadly, from rural towns to the outskirts of cities, bears are moving ever closer to where people live. So the question is, why are these encounters increasing now? Well, the Akita governor, Kenta Suzuki, has been briefing press on the subject. Here's Monocle's Ryuma Takahashi.
Every December, the World Heritage Temple in Kyoto, Kiyomizu Temple, announces the kanji of the year. It's a single Chinese character chosen to sum up the year's mood and major events. This year, the choice was bear. The reason is clear. Across Japan, bear sightings have surged and attacks on people have hit record levels. By the end of November, 230 people nationwide has been killed or injured by bears. Akita Prefecture in northeast Japan was hit hardest, with 66 cases, the highest number in the country. Akita Governor Kenta Suzuki explained that what makes this year's bear attacks different during the press briefing at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan.
Particular characteristics of this year is that these incidences, these injuries are happening in urban areas, in residential areas. And even in cases where people survive, where their lives are not taken, they're having very serious injuries, such as even to their faces, their heads, for example, in a very fearful situation. The fact that it is occurring right where people are living is leading to very high levels of fear among the population, which is also having a serious economic impact.
Wildlife management expert Professor Mayumi Yokoyama from the University of Hyogo also addressed the issue during a press conference at the Foreign Press Center, Japan. She points to two main factors: a very poor acorn crop, which bears rely on for food, and years of policies that focus too much on protecting bear numbers. Together, she said, this led to overpopulation and pushed bear into towns.
So competition amongst the bears themselves may be very fierce. So when these bears come to near human settlements to seek food, their behaviors tend to stay aggressive because there is already this strong competition amongst the bears. So when they come near humans, they maintain such aggressive attitudes towards humans.
Behind Japan's bear problem is another deeper issue: rapid population decline. In Akita, people have been leaving for big cities such as Tokyo for years, and the population is aging fast. The prefecture has recorded Japan's lowest birth rate for 29 years in a row. By 2050, 1 in every 2 people in Akita is expected to be over 65 years old. Governor Suzuki says one key factor is the breakdown of what are known as Satoyama areas, the villages where towns meet the mountains.
I think that one of the keys is about where the people are living as well. The situation is in those areas where it is the contact point between the bear's habitat, for example, in the mountains and the residential areas as well, what can be known as the Satoyama areas, where as there is less presence of humans there, less farming and so on, I believe that this is having an impact on the higher level of appearance of bears in these kind of areas.
Akita was once known for matagi culture, a traditional culture of bear hunters. But today, their numbers are shrinking fast because of aging and depopulation. This year, the shortage of hunters became so severe that by the end of October, the prefecture even asked Japan's self-defense forces for help.
First of all, in regards to the hunters, I do agree or believe that we do have a insufficiency both in the overall number of hunters that we have in Akita, and also there is the issue of aging of the population of the hunters themselves as well. This year, as we are seeing such a high increase in the need for culls, this is a situation where the hunters in Akita are unable to deal with what is needed on this level.
This year's bear crisis isn't just about the bears themselves. It's also about human society, aging, depopulation, and the decline of rural Japan. For Monocle in Tokyo, I'm Ryuma Takahashi.
Ryuma in Tokyo, thank you very much for that report. This is The Briefing. Now to a story from the fashion world, where Italian luxury brand Prada, after sparking a backlash earlier this year, trying to pass off a new pair of leather sandals as its own, when in fact they were inspired by Indian Kolhapuri sandals, is now trying to make amends. Prada has announced a line of limited edition made in India footwear in a deal with 2 Indian states. And here to tell us about it is Divya Venkataraman, fashion and culture journalist and Monocle contributor. Divya, great to have you on the show here on The Briefing. Tell us about this deal.
Yes, well, as you mentioned, Prada and a couple of Indian state bodies have now agreed, the states of Maharashtra and Karnataka, where these sandals have traditionally been made. They're from the 12th century. That's as far back as we know. They have agreed to make 2,000 pairs of these sandals in India and have them be part of this limited edition line. So that is interesting, but it's very discreet and kind of all wrapped up. I mean, it's not that part of it is not it's not anything bigger. But the other side of this agreement is a training academy sort of program that Prada has begun to speak about, but not revealed a whole lot of detail about. But there's a 3-year partnership that's been agreed to help train local artisans who then will also have access to Prada's academy in Italy, a select group of them. So I think that is something that it will be very interesting to hear more details on.
It is interesting that shows that they are now, I guess, kind of leaning into a bit of this after what happened back in June. I mean, what does it say about, or tell us more about this sort of novel approach, bringing in artisans? Is that a precedent within the fashion world as well?
Well, I think that's the thing. I think historically a lot of fashion brands who have been subject to this kind of backlash, this kind of sandal scandal, as I have heard it called, have tried to just ignore the problem or just kind of hope that it fades away. And I mean, the way that it works, it usually unfortunately does. So I think Prada is taking definitely a step that's a bit outside of the natural rhythms of how these things work. And without knowing too much more about what it will actually look like, I think that we can say that it's a positive step, at least, to acknowledge that that Prada's creations have a source that's much bigger and much more historic than them, and without kind of pushing that under the rug and just saying, even putting the name Kolhapuri on their sandals and having this Made in India label, I think that does change things. I think the bigger question, though, is about whether how it's going to actually benefit artisans, if it is.
Well, tell us more about that then. What makes you think it won't necessarily benefit artisans? Or, I mean, it sounds like it's something that would obviously also put the idea of Made in India, the brand Made in India, on the map a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and that's one of those things, one of the ideas that was put forward by the state-backed bodies when they were inking this deal was about how the kind of stamp of approval from a luxury house like Prada is going to put Indian craftsmanship on the global stage. And obviously Prada is such a powerful name in that space. And so I do think that in that way, there are real benefits. I think the reason that I say that is because it's not always obvious how that domino effect necessarily trickles down to the people who are making those, actually doing the leather craft and doing the work in the actual towns that these are made. But I think, having Indian craft be celebrated in that way is definitely a positive thing.
So it's a first step, not the final step.
Yes, maybe not the last one. And they've said that the artisans working on this will be fairly remunerated, is I think the term that was used. But I think that also, there are questions about what exactly that means. Sorry,
I was just going to say, just finally also then, I mean, is there another side of this in terms of the Indian consumer of fashion and brands like Prada? Is that a part of this? How do fashion houses like Prada and others look at the Indian consumer?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's something that's really, I think the fashion world is really in an interesting place with India as a market. I do think it is, has been described as this like the next kind of fashion powerhouse in waiting, just because of the number of, luxury, aspirational, upper middle class consumers that are kind of untapped in that market. But, and I think that, maybe a cynic would say that this is Prada positioning itself very well to capture that kind of market at a later stage, because Prada doesn't have retail Prada Beauty has retail, but Prada Fashion doesn't have retail in outlets in India yet. But it's indicated that that's something in the next 3 to 5 years that could be possible. So this would, of course, be a really good way to set up that kind of synergy between India and Prada and keep that association very alive in people's minds when it decides that it's the right time for that.
Divya Venkataraman, thank you very much for joining us, fashion journalist and Monocle contributor. That's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Hassan Anderson, our researcher was Joanna Moser, and our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.